Howdy, folks. This video is from a show I recently did on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity. If you like it, do all the YouTube things to let YouTube know to show the video to others. Be sure to like, comment, and share the video. And I am trying to grow my channel, so be sure and subscribe and hit the bell notification. Don't forget to check out Capturing Christianity and support the work that Cameron is doing there. Hope you enjoy this.
Jimmy, I'll turn it back over to you to kind of discuss a little bit near-death experiences, the research surrounding that. What typically happens in these near-death experiences, that sort of thing.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I think that the strongest case for the afterlife is not in any one of these three phenomena. They actually support each other because they blend into each other and you get the same element. So like I mentioned, a lot of people in their deathbed visions, they learn things they didn't previously know before that turn out to be true and they couldn't have guessed. They see light, they hear music, they're greeted by loved ones who are there to welcome them into the afterlife. Well, all that stuff happens in near-death experiences too. It's just further along. When you have the experience, you have either clinically died or almost clinically died, and you have basically a lot of the same sets of experiences. Now, in terms of history, there has been a shift. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, have been reported all through history. We do have historical records of them, but what would happen is in the past, we didn't have medical technology or know the techniques needed to revive someone once their heart had stopped. Sometimes the heart will restart spontaneously. And so for historical cases, near-death experiences are not nearly as common as they are now, because it would require someone's heart to restart. But that did sometimes happen. And then they would report, yeah, I was in the afterlife and this happened and I'm going to lead a better life now because of how much love I saw in the afterlife, for example. I know of a medieval case where a guy had a near-death experience and he came back, he settled his affairs with his family, and he went to join a monastery because he wanted to devote his life to God after that experience. Now, in the 1950s and especially the 1960s, new medical techniques and technology came online that allowed us for the first time to have a real hope of reviving someone who had experienced cardiac arrest. And this led to an explosion of new reports of near-death experiences because we'd been able to bring so many people back that we'd never been able to bring back before. And they reported a lot of phenomena that, and as I mentioned, this first came really to public attention in the mid-1970s with Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. They reported a lot of the same things from deathbed visions. They also reported some new things, like they would report autoscopy, or seeing, I mentioned that earlier, where you see yourself from an outside perspective, typically from an above perspective where you can see the doctors and nurses working on you. They would report sometimes going through a tunnel, or if not a tunnel, at least a transition or movement of some kind. I've been told, by a researcher, although I haven't verified this for myself, that in Japan, for example, they don't visualize it as a tunnel. They visualize it as crossing a bridge into a beautiful garden. And then people would also report seeing a beautiful garden or a beautiful city or something like a park where people were very happy, at least in most of them. In 20% of them, there were negative elements. Sometimes they would describe them as even hellish. Like one person got brought back. It was a woman, and she just said, all she would say is, "I saw Dante's Inferno." In any event, there's been a lot of research done on these in recent years. Multiple researchers have looked into this. There are a lot of good books. I don't recommend the solo books. The ones I recommend are the ones that are case study collections, where you're not just looking at one experience that could be an outlier. Maybe someone misremembered something or misperceived something or is even lying. But if you aggregate a lot of cases together, then you get a much better understanding of what tends to happen in these experiences. And as I mentioned, they contain veridical information, a bunch of them. In particular, because it's the best book on this out there right now, I recommend the book by Titus Rivas and others, The Self Does Not Die, which shows over 100 cases of that have vertical information with independent validation. And I've already given one example of that, but one that I'd like to mention is a kind of experience that also is a commonality with deathbed visions. This happens both in deathbed visions and in near-death experiences. It's what's known in parapsychology as a peak in Darien experience. Peak is P-E-A-K, like the peak of a mountain, and Darien is a province in Panama. The phrase peak in Darien comes from an old poem, and I won't go into all that history, but what it refers to in modern parapsychological literature is either a deathbed vision or a near-death experience where you not only are greeted by departed loved ones, but you see someone in the afterlife who you didn't know was dead. And then it turns out to be true. One of the first reports of this was reported by the British writer Frances Cobb in an essay called Peak in Darien, which is where this experience got its name from. And she recounts an incident where you have a woman who's dying. I think it may have been of tuberculosis or consumption, as they called it at the time. But she's dying in England. She's got a big family of, lots of brothers and sisters. And as she's dying, she has a deathbed vision where she sees 3 of her siblings who everybody already knew were dead. It's like, oh, here's this sibling and this sibling and this sibling. But then she sees a 4th sibling who is her brother that everyone believes is alive and well in India. And the fact she just saw this 4th sibling who everyone thinks is just fine and living in India, because of the British Empire at the time, it was so distressing to hear that he was in the afterlife that one of the women in the room just couldn't handle it and had to leave and just fled the room. But then it turned out what this dying woman saw was accurate. And they got letters informing them, regretfully, your 4th sibling has died in India. And he died before the dying woman had seen him in her deathbed vision. So he was, if he survived, if survival is real, he was in the afterlife at the time of the deathbed vision. And there are other examples of that. One that's particularly strong. Now, in this case, they had no way of knowing that the brother was dead. Another case where something much like that happens was reported by Sir William Barrett, who wrote the first major book on deathbed visions. And his wife was a surgeon, a doctor, a medical doctor, who worked at a women's hospital. And so she was attending a woman who had a heart condition. She was experiencing heart failure, and she was pregnant. And so this was a very difficult pregnancy, and she gave birth to the child. But it was such a strain on her system that she was starting to die, which, maternal postpartum death was very common. This is around 1923, 24. It used to be much more common than it is now. Well, she sees her father, and she's narrating her deathbed vision. She sees her father come to welcome her into the afterlife, and she says, oh, there's Vida. And Vida was her sister. So she didn't know Vida was dead. Turns out Vida was dead. Vida had died like 3 weeks earlier. But because she's got a heart condition, because she's in the hospital and pregnant with a difficult pregnancy that is in the end going to kill her, the matron of the hospital said, do not tell her about Vida's death. It would be too much of a strain on her system. Just keep that from her for now. And so the family knew about Vida's death, but did not tell the woman. They even went to the extent, at the matron's suggestion, of her husband pre-screened all of her mail. So anyone who wrote to her, which they did back in the day before we had texting, anything anyone wrote to her, her husband read first to make sure it did not contain any information about Vida dying. And so they rigorously screened her to keep this information away from her. And yet, as she's having her deathbed vision, she sees her sister Vida in the afterlife. And this is what's known as a peak in Darien experience. Well, the same thing happens in NDEs, where you actually venture a little bit into the afterlife, and you may see your loved ones coming to greet you, and you may see someone you weren't expecting to see. So this is another commonality between these experiences that points in the same direction. And it's an example of veridical information. The person, had no natural way of knowing it. It's not something you could have guessed, and it turned out to be true. So that would be one data point favoring this being an objectively real experience rather than a dying brain hallucination or something like that. So I guess that's the basics of what I wanted to cover with those two experiences.
And before we go, just a reminder to do all those great YouTube things. You can help my channel grow by liking, commenting, and sharing the video. And be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a new video. These days, I have multiple videos coming out every week. Thanks so much, and God bless you.